Puritans were a religious group in England who believed that the Church of England, the Anglican Church, which had broken away from the Catholic Church, was still too papist, still too many trappings of Rome, and they wanted to purify the church, get rid of all of those Roman Catholic items. When they were able to come to the New World, beginning in the great Puritan migration of the 1630s, they came over here and basically were able to do what they wanted. And they found that they were going to establish what they called a kingdom upon the hill. Witchcraft was a punishable offense from at least the 13th century in England. So there was always, talk of witches and so forth. It was kind of a acknowledged belief at the time.
Police, the horse comes riding up to this home behind us, knocks on the door, and they say, "You're coming with me because you're a witch."
What normally happened in witchcraft accusations in Old England and in the early part of New England was you would find a victim who was usually the typical witch, an older woman who maybe had seen better days and now was destitute, who went around muttering, who wasn't happy with her lot in life. Somebody who typically would be what you would expect to be a witch.
In the 1600s here, it was someone who had made a pact with Satan to do evil. But in court, they were trying to prove that they were causing physical harm by magical means.
The biggest catch-all is just a witch is someone who's out of step with their culture, out of step with their community, or poses a problem to their community.
By the 1690s, a lot of theologians in England were talking about maybe there not being such a thing as witches. It became a very controversial subject. In New England, there had been cases of witchcraft before. In many cases, what happened was somebody would be accused, brought before magistrates, tried, maybe found innocent or found guilty, hanged, and that would be the end of it. Salem broke the mold. It was completely different. And why is the question that makes all of these books occur, because people still are trying to figure out, what the answer was.
They called him a doctor, various doctors who aren't named. They pray, they offer home remedies. They're treating it like an illness.
A number of witnesses saying that they were doing things which appeared to them to be supernormal, not something that you could normally do. It wasn't epilepsy. They had experienced that before. They knew what that was. It was something really different.
And then one of the doctors, presumably William Griggs, said it must be an evil hand.
And eventually, the girls start naming names. The first three accused, they were the typical type of witchcraft victims.
What would be their motives to pick out these three people?
Probably because there was general gossip about them. Tituba the slave, she's in a worse position to defend herself than the others since she is a slave. Some say that her master, Paris, beat her to get a confession.
When she was questioned, Tituba said, I'm not responsible. It's not something I did.
She finally admits to it because the question just kept coming, repeating. I mean, she says, no, she didn't do it. She didn't do it. She doesn't want to do that. She loves the children. She wouldn't hurt them. And then they keep asking, are you a witch, or when did you become a witch? They just repeat it endlessly. And finally she says, yes.
The devil had come to her and told her to afflict the children, or she would be killed. So she started afflicting the children. And she said that others not here are also witches. And her testimony was so sincere. These people, could not normally be hoodwinked. I mean, they were reasonable people. Just because they were, lived 300 years ago didn't mean that they didn't have a brain. But this was something that was so beyond their normal experience. And everybody had come to this first examination because it was such a wondrous thing. And when Tituba said that, they started looking around wondering, if the person next to them was also in league with the devil. Why Salem flared up so much is that after the first three were accused, the next two who were accused never get accused in witchcraft cases. They were full members, covenant members of the church. Martha Corey, who was a full-fledged church member of Salem Village, and Rebecca Nurse of Salem. What that meant, today it doesn't sound like any big deal. There's a lot of members of churches. Salem Village had a population of 500. Of that 500, about 80 were church members, full-fledged members. And in order to be a church member, you had to get up before the congregation and explain to them how you knew through God's regeneration you were a saved person. You were one of the elect of God. And you were voted in by the rest of the elect that you had the seal of God on you. And people started saying, my God, if a church member, covenant member of God, is in league with the devil, anyone can be. And this really brought the thing to become the mass outbreak that it became. It was that kind of fear that, who am I looking at? Because it got to be known by the afflicted children that the devil was attacking Salem Village, that it was a direct attack, first in the village and then in Massachusetts, trying to bring down the Commonwealth. The afflicted children were saying that specters, invisible to everyone else except themselves, of someone like Rebecca Nurse was hurting them, was physically doing them damage. And they would give depositions of this, but nobody else saw it. Civil authorities tended to believe that if these children said these things, God would never permit the apparition, the specter, of an innocent person to afflict someone. From the get-go, they determined that this testimony was going to be valid because God wouldn't allow it any other way.
And the other is evidence of maleficium after like a conflict. So I'm home minding my own business, and Biddy James comes along and she wants to borrow some cornmeal. And I'm really sick of her always borrowing cornmeal from me because she's a mooch, and so I say, no, you can't have any cornmeal today, I'm sorry, I don't have any to spare. And she goes away scolding and muttering and says, well, I'll really regret it if I don't give her cornmeal. And then, a day or two later, my calf, which was perfectly healthy, falls over dead.
So again, if I didn't like your family and I started getting ill, or my daughter got ill, or something strange was happening on my farm, I could very conceivably accuse you
Especially if
and put you on trial.
Well, especially if I'd come around and acted suspiciously in your eyes, and then something happened.
The third and perhaps most infamous and only physical piece of evidence was the witch's teat. Your body, you would be stripped naked and searched for where you suckled your familiar spirit.
At these preliminary hearings, usually the children would go into all sorts of hysterics. They would start claiming that they were being bitten, and they would show bite marks on their arm by the accused. They would go into all sorts of contortions and so forth. People there would see that and would then write a deposition to what they had seen, and this in the trial was allowed as real evidence of someone being afflicted by a witch.
Do we have any idea medically what was happening to these people?
Any book that's been written by a scholar in the last 25, 30 years is going to come up with what their definitive answer is, a theory, unfortunately, because we don't know.
We don't really know what the cause was, although most historians agree that it was sort of psychological or spiritual in nature.
You can tell that some of them could turn on and off their afflictions. And in at least one case, when one of the adolescent girls were claiming that they were seeing a witch that only she could see, and it was afflicting her, one of the adults there said, "Stop it," kind of chased her down. And she said, "Well, I must have my sport."
I don't think they were faking all the time, but part of the time they must have been, if only because they didn't dare admit that they had been playing around. And some of the time I think they convinced themselves that there was something wrong, and that fed the fear.
(1692) was a very difficult year in Massachusetts and also in Salem Village. There were a lot of outside fears and things happening within society that it wasn't just a normal time. There had been a decimating Indian war in the 1670s, and in 1692, Abenaki Indians from Maine started attacking the settlements to the north. And the idea was, oh my God, we're going to have another Indian war. We're really terrified of what's going to be happening.
The colony, like many others, was without a charter for a long time to make it legal, so the government was just sort of treading water.
It was functioning, but they weren't sure if they were going to be legal. They were concerned that their own land maybe wouldn't be theirs anymore.
Accused who not only were you thrown in jail, but they were fined to stay nights in jail?
Well, it was rent. The families paid it. The survivors paid it. You weren't supposed to get out of jail until you paid your bill, and of course it accumulated if you stayed in jail, so that was a problem.
I think if they had been able to try people at the very beginning, at the outset of the panic, then maybe it wouldn't have been as big as it was. But because they had to wait several months before a trial could be put together, it was just a perfect time to let it kind of get bigger and out of hand. In a way, it's a perfect storm of circumstances. And so it seems to me like something was bound to happen in that context.
The interesting thing about the witchcraft trials is, today we think it was a kangaroo court and, no one had rights or anything. It was done according to the best English principles for that time, which meant that you had to go through a grand jury. If an indictment was issued by the grand jury, then a jury trial took place. and it would include a number of your peers, although the peers were members of the church who owned property. So it didn't include the lower class, and obviously it was only men. Many of the trials would last half a day at most. They didn't have lawyers at that time. You weren't represented by anyone, and some poor woman who had never been through this experience wouldn't know what to do at trial.
Guilt.
Because they were excommunicated, they were not afforded a Christian burial. And so they were buried in ravines and sort of ditches close to wherever they were hung.
Accused of witchcraft, she declared, "I am innocent, and God will clear my innocence."
She's not feeling well. She's an old woman. She has a lot of people who like her in the neighborhood. They sign petitions saying, this is a good Christian woman. This is a mistake. She's actually found not guilty. And when this is announced, the afflicted girls, the ones who are presumably bewitched, screech and fall down, tormented presumably by her spirit. The head judge, Stoughton, asks the jury to reconsider, then they find her guilty.
Guilt.
Some of those people who were accused would say to their families, well, I didn't know I was a witch, but I must be, because I'm being accused by these people. And I mean, what brings that on? It was a profound thing that was happening.
Some of them thought, these terrible things are happening. All these people believe it. Maybe I did something bad that let the devil get a hold on me, and I didn't know it. They were also panicked because of the endless questions.
A number of them figured out that if you cooperated, you weren't going to be tried right away. And at the trial, everyone tried was found guilty and executed. So it was kind of a stay. And they figured if you can survive long enough, maybe they'll be able to survive this whole ordeal.
The confessors were kept separate as witnesses for use in later trials. I mean, who else did you see at the witch meeting? This is presumably someone who was there. They can identify the other people who were involved, theoretically involved.
And in fact, none of those who confessed were executed. George Jacobs, when he was being examined, was trying to defend himself, and the magistrates were just badgering him. The afflicted people were giving evidence against him. His granddaughter had said that he was a witch. He had everybody against him. His church had failed him, civil authorities had, his family had. And he finally says, well, burn me or hang me, I'll stand in the truth of Christ.
One of the great ironies of being in Salem is the word Salem itself means peace.
Yes, salam.
Yeah. Islam salam means peace be upon you. In Hebrew, shalom means peace be upon you.
Yeah, kind of a sad commentary, especially when you consider that the community that persecuted these people was an avowedly religious and Christian community. It's a shame to think this idea of persecution was built into their social structure to such an intense degree.
Anybody around here who's been a townie is going to be related to several of the witchcraft victims. The one I knew about was a family name, Esty, Mary Esty. She was the sister of Rebecca Nurse. And Mary Esty did a wonderful petition while she was in jail. It's a very heart-wrenching petition.
The accusations go too far up the social ladder. One of the girls accuses the governor's wife, and they finally say, "Nope, I'm sorry, you're mistaken."
Once there were doubts, finally people reconsidered the whole thing.
And they started to realize that it was getting completely out of hand, and they just put a stop to it. They just put an end to it, sort of abruptly.
You're in Danvers. Danvers is formerly Salem Village. When I was growing up, in polite society, you didn't talk about the witchcraft. It was a time that everyone felt was a terrible time. Let's not talk about it, and just were ashamed, absolutely ashamed of it. And I always ascribed when we did the excavation as the time when we started to turn that around and say, yeah, it was a terrible time, but there are some real lessons that you can learn.
Did the original young girls who did the accusing, and then later the Reverend and other significant people, did they ever publicly apologize?
Reverend Paris, a couple of years after, he does say at a church meeting that he was wrong.
He's sorry that he had made mistakes. He was trying to do the right thing. Paris eventually is forced out. He finds it very hard to be able to stay there because there's groups that are in favor of him and groups that say, you know, you helped bring about the death of my mother or my aunt.
Samuel Sewell, who was one of the judges in the witchcraft court, actually stood up and his minister read a specific apology for being wrong.
Ann Putnam in the early 1700s wants to be a full covenant member. This is her signature as a young woman, and this is her confession, which she had to stand up before the congregation, and she basically says, I'm sorry for accusing people that I now believe were totally innocent. She acknowledges, you know, what mistakes she had made, although, you know, it's couched, the devil made me do it. And that's what much of the explanation eventually was, that the devil had been present and had been real.
I get more sympathetic to the afflicted little girls when we think about how different it must be to go from a life where you have to work hard and obey, and then all of a sudden, some of the most powerful people in your world are saying, there, don't worry, you are afflicted. We are going to come together and pray for you, we're going to fast for you, and we're going to pay attention to you, and you don't have to do any of your usual labors, and we're just going to take care of you. What an entrancing turn of events that must have been.
What do you think the lesson people learn from it is?
Not to jump to conclusions. I mean, there can be real problems, 9/11, Pearl Harbor, and sick children in this case, convulsing, assuming that they were really sick from something, but to be sure of what is actually happening before you start jumping to tragic conclusions.
As a historian, I've always found it unfair to have expectations of people in the past to somehow understand the world the way we see the world. Not that I'm trying to be an apologist by any means, but I think it's important to understand it. This was the rational thing to be doing. And that itself is a little bit more chilling, and I think it should serve as a reminder that we should always interrogate what our assumptions are.
Those people who were hanged, 19 people, men and women, several who died in jail, one who was crushed to death, they were just average people who had been caught up in the worst event of their existence. And they had been given a choice, confess or be tried and probably executed. And the one thing in common that all of those who were executed has was they could have said, yes, I am a witch, and hoped that they could escape for a period of time, and maybe then it would run its course, and then they would live. Or they could have stayed with the truth. Many of them really believed that to belie themselves, tell a giant lie, was not going to gain them salvation. If I were there then, I probably would have confessed. I'm not sure I would have had the moral gumption to be able to say, I'm not a witch, you're not going to make me confess. Because here you have average people who, at the point of this kind of confrontation, can actually go beyond themselves and do something that should be remembered and celebrated.